We've all had experiences with leaders, some good, some bad. I'm going to give you the power to create your own leader. Think about the kind of leader you would want to create who would be successful in the 21st century, in a world in which things are moving much faster. What attributes, skills, attitudes would this person need to lead a team, either in a professional setting, a community, or in a personal setting, such as in a home? I've worked a great deal in the area of leadership and do a fair amount of leadership training. And this is an exercise that I do with many groups. Here's an example of the typical kinds of responses that I hear when I give them this activity. Visionary, flexible, takes risks, trustworthy, good communicator, solicits ideas, engages others, someone who's a good listener, calm when facing chaos, someone who's humorous, supportive, manages conflict, someone who can anticipate opportunities, someone who's really good at building a team, someone who's willing to change his or her mind, someone who can see things from multiple perspectives. Now I want you to think about another question. The question is, from this list, what attributes would you also associate with creativity? When I ask participants to do this in leadership training, they review their list and they mark off the attributes. Now thinking about creativity, not leadership, but thinking about creativity that they associate with the concept of creativity. The typical connections I see are things like, well, visionary, flexible, someone who takes risks, someone who solicits ideas, humorous, someone who can anticipate opportunities, who can forecast things that will happen in the future, someone who's able to change his or her mind to be influenced by others, and who can see things from multiple perspectives. Now, why do I do this? Why do I do this exercise? I do this to begin to highlight a connection between creativity and leadership. And I would suggest that these two areas are beginning to merge. When I do this exercise, all groups are able to find connections. Some can find so many connections that their list of leadership attributes is completely circled. They connect everything from their list to creativity. Today, I believe there's a very strong connection between creativity and leadership. How we view leaders and what leaders need to be successful is contextual. It changes over time. Theories of leadership, therefore, evolve over time. Leadership is sort of defined by the spirit of the time. Let's look at some theories that have stood out over time in chronological order from the field of leadership studies. Trait theory approach. The trait theory approach to leadership is the assumption that leadership is something that's innate, something that you're born with, something that you come into the world with. And the trick is to find some universal set of traits that can be useful in identifying these people so that you can then put them into positions of leadership. In some ways, the field of creativity started the same way, examining traits that are inside of creative people so that we can identify them and select them. This goes back about 100 years ago in leadership studies. Now, this particular approach came up short. They didn't find a universal set of leadership traits. So the theories and the research evolved, and the next wave of research in the field of leadership studies looked at the behaviors of leadership. What did leaders do? Not what they were born with, but what did they do in order to be effective? And when you look at the behaviors, they found that they sorted into two categories. Task-oriented behaviors, the kind of behaviors that helps to get things done, and relationship-oriented behaviors. Behaviors that help to build harmony in teams and help to create good interpersonal connections with others. This then went to another approach to leadership, situational theories, in terms of looking at these behaviors Situational theories suggest that understanding the behaviors is fine, but how do you deploy those behaviors? Well, you should deploy them based on the situation. So sometimes it's best to focus on the task, to engage in task-oriented behaviors when you really need to get things done when there's a crisis. And other times it's more beneficial to focus on relationships when you need to get things done with people. More recently, and I'm skipping a number of theories, more recently the talk is about transformational leadership. Transformational leadership refers to leaders who are able to get the most out of others, who are able to draw the fullest potential out of others. They transform others that they interact with and work with. In this lecture, we explore three ideas: how the evolving theories of leadership, as I've just described them, have begun to move in the direction of embracing creativity, merging, if you will, in some ways with creativity. The second idea we explore is that leadership's role is crucial in promoting creativity. And then the third idea that we'll examine in this lecture is creativity specifically as a leadership skill, as a leadership competence. And I'll make a case that creative problem solving is now considered a core leadership competence. As you listen to these ideas, I hope that you'll reflect on your own leadership development. Let me describe someone to you. Athlete, humanitarian, a cancer research activist. In 1980, after having one leg amputated at age 23, he embarked on a cross-country run. In fact, across Canada, no small country. He ran the equivalent of a marathon every day. After 143 days, he had covered 3,339 miles. Unfortunately, the cancer began to spread to his lungs, and it forced him to stop. His name is Terry Fox. He began his quest with little fanfare, and he died within a year after he stopped. However, by this time, he was known around the world. Today, the annual Terry Fox Run is the largest single-day fundraiser for cancer research. Initially, his goal was to raise $1 for every Canadian, $24 million. To date, the Terry Fox Foundation has generated over $600 million in his name. What's the point to the story? The point is, leadership isn't about position. No one appointed Terry Fox to a leadership position. No one gave him a title, but he decided to make a difference. He decided to have an influence. And when you look at contemporary theories of leadership, you see that they're not limiting leadership to position or power. It's not about the title that you have, it's about what you do. Let's examine transformational leadership. In transformational leadership theories, there are 4 factors that are often talked about. I think many of these factors really begin to tie into creativity. Idealized influence is one of those factors. That's where the transformational leader presents a strong role model for others, which sort of leads to the next factor, inspirational motivation. They inspire a shared vision. They get people to come together and fuse their energy as they advance on some vision. We know the importance of vision for creativity, so we can start to see a connection to creativity through this theory around leadership. The next 2 factors make an even stronger connection. In fact, this next factor is called intellectual stimulation. And when leadership theorists talk about intellectual stimulation, they in fact use the words creativity, innovation, creative thinking, and problem solving. Intellectual stimulation is about leaders who stimulate their followers to be creative and innovative. It's recognizing that as a leader in a complex world, you can't have all the answers, that you need to draw ideas out of others in order for a team or organization to be successful. It's also about challenging followers' beliefs, challenging their assumptions, challenging them to think in new ways. This kind of thinking, this kind of approach promotes followers to think in different ways and to engage in careful problem solving, which is essential in the 21st century. Intellectual stimulation also encourages followers to try approaches and to think of innovative ways to handle issues. The last one, individualized consideration, the fourth factor of transformational leadership, connects to a topic we've gone deeply into. Individualized consideration is all about leadership that creates a supportive environment, an environment that allows individuals to think in creative ways. If we go back to the three facets that predict creativity, those three facets are person, process, and environment. If we think about these three facets like gears interacting with one another, leadership in a way becomes the lubricant that allows these gears to work, to not stick, to flow. Often when I do leadership training, the individuals in that program will say, you know, this is terrific, but you know who should be here? Our boss should be here. And they're right. When you look at the environment for creativity, what research has shown is that anywhere from 40 to 70% of the psychological environment, that climate for creativity, is directly linked to leadership behavior. Let me give you an example. In my first year of teaching, I was given a GM Quality Educator internship. I worked at a forge plant for the summer. I worked in the training and development office of this plant. And I was given a project to assess the climate, the environment in this plant. There were 20-some teams that we had complete a survey about the environment. We used Ekval's 10 dimensions. I was tasked with the responsibility of analyzing that data and giving feedback to the teams. This is a story about two teams who had the exact same job. They were called the extruders. I looked at the results for one group just before they came into the room, and they had honestly pretty disastrous results. It was the first shift extruders. When they came into the room, they were quiet, hardly any energy. They plopped themselves down. I began to describe these 10 dimensions of a creative climate: challenge and freedom, risk-taking. And then in the middle of my presentation, the supervisor stopped me and said, wait, challenge, freedom, playfulness, risk-taking, that has nothing to do with what these guys do. They make axles. That's all they do. What's the relevance of this? And it suddenly occurred to me, as the supervisor talked, I now knew why their climate was so poor. Remember what I said. 40 to 70% of the psychological climate can be linked to leadership behavior. Now, I was a bit confused because the next group to come in was the third shift extruders. And if you've been around a plant environment, you know that you don't sign up for the third shift. You get banished to the third shift. And what surprised me was that of all the teams, the third shift extruders had by far the most positive results on these 10 dimensions. When they came into the room, they were laughing and joking. A couple of guys were sort of wrestling with each other. When I started, I had to ask them to quiet down so I could begin the presentation. I delivered my presentation on these 10 dimensions. As I was presenting, the supervisor said, you know, this is fascinating information. How might we use this information? Guys, what else can we do? And I noticed there's some areas where we have some opportunity for growth. This supervisor was demonstrating a completely different kind of leadership compared to the first shift. And again, that explained to me the reasons why perhaps that their results were so positive. Let me share a model with you. I call it the three-legged stool model, because if you remove any one of these legs, it collapses. Or you might think about it as a Venn diagram. The three elements, the three legs in this model are creativity, innovation, and leadership. They all intersect and reinforce one another. What combines all three of them is change. When we decide to be creative, we're intentionally going after change. It's a process that leads to change. Innovation is the successful adoption of change. Leadership. We often look to leaders to be a catalyst for change, to bring about change. So change unifies all three. Let's look at how these elements interact. So where does creativity intersect with innovation? Well, in order for innovation to happen, we need creative ideas. 88% of organizations in the US have innovation or innovate in their mission, vision, or values. But innovation just doesn't happen because you put it in your value statement or in your website. We first need creativity. It's the stimulant to innovation. Let's look at the overlap between innovation and leadership. As we were just discussing, leaders set the climate for change. They set the climate for innovation. Leadership can put the cap on an environment for creative thinking and ultimately for innovation. Let's look at the third area of overlap, the overlap between leadership and creativity. Now here it's being argued that creative problem solving, the process that you've learned, this universal creative thinking process, in fact is now a core leadership trait. Well, better said, a core leadership ability. An ability that can be developed. An ability that needs to be deployed in a more complex world. Michael Mumford, University of Oklahoma, has an eloquent argument for why creative problem solving is now considered a core leadership skill. He has a theory of leadership that he calls a capabilities model of leadership. He lays out a solid case for why leaders need to be creative problem solvers. Let's examine his line of thinking. He says that opposed to thinking about specific behaviors, leadership can be framed in terms of capabilities, knowledge, and skills that contribute to effective leadership. Now, if you want to understand what these capabilities are, you have to look at what leaders do. So Michael Mumford says the development of a capability model of leadership should begin by identifying the performance requirements placed on leaders. Let's continue with his line of thinking. So what are leaders required to do? He says, a leader's performance within an organizational context is based on the degree to which he or she can successfully facilitate others towards meaningful goals. That's what they're required to do. Now, as we're facilitating others towards goals, it doesn't always go smoothly. So Mumford says that successful goal attainment depends on an ability to circumvent and resolve issues that impede progress. The selection and implementation of actions to bring goals to fruition involves problem solving. So, as we pursue goals, we can anticipate that we're going to run into challenges, especially goals that are more innovative. Mumford concludes that leadership performance, therefore, is directly related to an individual's capacity to use his or her creative problem-solving skills to resolve complex social problems. Now, what are complex social problems? He says complex social problems are made up of three characteristics. They're ill-defined, they're novel, and they're ambiguous. And he suggests that more and more in a fast-paced world, we are contending with these complex social problems. Ill-defined meaning there's no single solution path, no right or wrong answer. The problem can be defined in any number of ways, and solutions have to be invented or discovered. They're novel. In a fast-moving world, we face increasingly more novel, more frequent novel challenges, meaning our past experience and knowledge is not sufficient to resolve the present situation. We simply can't go into our solution bank and say, Gosh, I solved a problem just like this 2 months ago. Let me go back and use the exact same solution. And they're ambiguous. They're sort of gray, fuzzy. There are gaps in information, or there's a plethora of information of which only some of it is relevant, which requires clarification and diagnosis. Now, what he's found in his research is that the available evidence indicates that creative problem solving may indeed represent an important influence on leader performance. In fact, he has longitudinal research that demonstrates that. So that's research. But what about the real world? IBM conducted a recent survey of 1,550-some executives around the world. The study asked these CEOs to describe the world that they live and work in now, and they said that they operate in a world that's substantially more volatile, uncertain, and complex, and they suggest that it will become even more complex. Today's complexity is only expected to rise, and more than half of these CEOs, in the face of that, doubted their ability to manage this kind of complexity. And when asked, well, in the face of this complexity, what leadership skills are going to be most important going forward into the future, they spoke with one voice. They said that creativity is the most important leadership quality. Now, I'm not saying all creators are leaders. They're not leaders, not necessarily. But leaders today may need to be, probably have to be creative, given the environments that they work in. Let's look at how we develop creative leadership. Here's a model that describes our movement towards becoming a creative leader. It's a model I want you to think about in terms of your own development, especially now that we're nearing the end of this course. At the lowest level of development, we have what we call a spectator. This is someone who's unconsciously unskilled about their creativity. They leave it up to chance. They don't know about facilitating their own creativity through deliberate practices like the ones that you've learned. Through awareness, recognizing the importance of creativity, we might move to the second level of development. We call this person a student of creativity. This is where we become consciously aware of our deficiencies, consciously unskilled. We know what we don't know. We're at the beginning stages of learning. Through practice, deliberate practice in terms of trying out the tools, moving our creativity from chance to being able to deploy it on demand, we move to a third level of development. At the third level, we become consciously skilled. We refer to this person as a skilled practitioner, someone who's able to efficiently and effectively, with some mastery, use the tools, use the process of creativity. And at the fourth level, we have the highest level of development. Not everyone reaches this level of development. We call this person the creative leader, because at this level, the individual is unconsciously skilled. Creativity is simply a way of life. It's a way of being. The spirit and the tools and the skills and the attitudes have become so internalized it's second nature. Many years ago, when my children were young, I was having dinner with the boys. And my oldest son announced to me in the middle of dinner, his name's Gabriel. He said, "Dad, you know, you're not like other dads." Well, that's curious. Well, what do you mean, Gabe, I'm not like other dads? And he said, well, what you just did just now, you just asked me a question. You do that a lot. I said, well, in what other ways am I not like other dads? And he said, well, you know, when I'm fighting with Anthony, you say things like, well, how else might you solve this problem? And it suddenly dawned on me, especially when he used that invitational stem, that my training and creativity had bled into my parenting skills, my role as a parent, really unbeknownst to me until he reflected that back to me. That's what it looks like at this level of development, the creative leader. These things become automatic. It's a way of living. As we move up in these levels of development, our breadth of impact gets broader. As a skilled practitioner, using a tool and using the process on a task is terrific. That's great. It helps to resolve that task. Hopefully you get to a creative breakthrough. But the breadth of our impact is even greater as we move up to the highest level of development as a creative leader. Because when we're a creative leader, we carry this with us all the time, and we transform the context that we're in. We model creative behavior. We create climates that encourage others to be creative. This is a difference between doing and being. I'll give you an example. We have mentors in our lives who help us to grow and develop. We learn from mentors. And we can also learn from people we might struggle with, people who we might consider tormentors. When I was pursuing my PhD, I worked in a consultancy to help support my graduate studies. And I worked with someone who was established in the field of creativity, was a really good, skilled practitioner who was excellent at delivering creativity training and was very effective at facilitating others. He could do creativity, but he had a difficult time being creative. I remember after we had finished a training event and we sat down to debrief the training event, and he turned to his team and he said, "Right, okay, well, we're done now. Let's think about the participants. Who was your least favorite participant?" I was shocked. Didn't we just teach deferring judgment and affirmative judgment? And this kind of behavior spilled over into his leadership behavior. So this is what I mean between doing and being. It's one thing to do creativity, but it's a completely different matter to make it part of your own being. Evaluate yourself. Think about yourself as a creative leader. Where are you? Some people naturally, by nature, sort of slot in higher along this plan, this model for leadership development. Where are you in terms of internalizing these skills? Let's think about an area that we've focused a lot of time talking about, divergent thinking, the ability to defer judgment, the ability to strive for quantity, the ability to make connections, to look at random things and see a new insight or have a new idea. Seeking novelty. Do you live those principles? Are you starting to make them a part of your natural behavior? Ask yourself, to what degree do I really support other people's creativity? To what degree do I create a climate for creativity for others? Think about what you can do to advance your own development. Generate 4 or 5 action steps of what you can do to support others' creativity. Let's look at how we might take this forward. I'm sure the skills that you've learned in this course not only make you personally more creative, but they can also help to make you a better leader, and thus a better contributor to creative solutions by others as well. And if you're not sure you're a creative leader, let me tell you a story by Joel Barker. The story goes like this. A man's walking along a beach, an older man, and he looks off into the distance, and he sees a figure running back and forth on the beach. And he's kind of confused, he's curious. This person's out there on his own. It almost looks like he's dancing. As he gets closer, he sees that this is a young man, and he's running between the shoreline and starfish that are spread all over the beach. And he's picking up one starfish at a time, and he's running to the edge, and he's throwing them into the water. And the older man looks at this young man and thought, what a crazy act. There's no way he can help all these starfish. So he goes up to the young man and he points out to him that this is ridiculous. There's no way you can help all of these starfish. What are you doing? He says to him. The young man doesn't respond. He turns his back to the older man. He walks over, picks up a starfish, jogs down to the shoreline, and he tosses the starfish into the water. He turns and he walks back to the older man and he says, I may not be able to help all of them, but I just helped that one. So if you're ever in doubt about your leadership, think about that story. It's about what you do, not the title you hold. And if you use your creativity, if you internalize it, you'll find that you'll pass it forward to others, that you will be in a better position to enable others to be more creative.